Good evening. I have a question, and it fits right into, or rather, it can be embraced in our subject tonight. The question is, please talk to us about business. And actually, business is one of the very, very simple things to bring under the jurisdiction of spiritual activity. It seems to me, unless I just have some special gift that way, but it seems to me that always it has been one of the simplest things for me, the subject of business. And the reason is that I do not see business as separate and apart from one's spiritual experience. In other words, to me, business is as spiritual as any form of living. It's as spiritual as going to church. It's as spiritual as prayer. It doesn't mean that all concepts of business fit into that, but business as it is, and as I understand it, is really a part of spiritual living. I think I can best illustrate that with this experience. In the very first year of the Depression, a man who had been a millionaire in the building business, not believing that the Depression would last so long, lost his entire business and his entire fortune. And his wife had to go out to work, and he himself took menial work, something far below the dignity of day labor, and was having a very difficult time with it. And that man came in to me one day at my office and said that he wanted help, but owing to conditions there was no way to get it. However, a man owed him a large sum of money, so large that if he could collect it, he and his wife could live out the Depression and wait for things to come back again and be in comfort. And could I help him collect that money through metaphysical means? And I said, no, there is no provision in the spiritual world for collecting a debt. As a matter of fact, we're told not to live on yesterday's manna. We're told not to go to law to sue. We're told to forgive 70 times 7, to forgive our debtors as they forgive, as we would be forgiven. And so I said there's no provision whatsoever for collecting a debt spiritually. But that should in no wise interfere with your supply or the amount of it, for the simple reason that God is omnipresent and God is infinite. Therefore, supply must be infinite and it must be omnipresent. It must be where you are. And the blessing is, it is not dependent on man whose breath is in his nostrils. It is not dependent on any man's favors. Business is an activity of God, and it's nothing whatsoever to do with man except that man is an instrument for the showing forth of God's business. Well, then what am I to do? Well, the first step would be to forgive your debtor. And you can imagine the impression that made with a vast sum of money that he had looked upon as his last hope. No, I said, the only thing I can see, according to the spiritual text, is to forgive that debt. You need not tell the man you've forgiven it. Forgive it within yourself, within your heart. If the time comes when he wishes to pay it or can pay it, that will be his demonstration. But your demonstration is to forgive it. And then, not looking on yesterday's manna, let us see what happens with God today. And that very night, he received a call from a real estate man saying that a piece of property could be sold if some way could be found to fit a factory onto it in the peculiar shape that it was, and would he look at it and give them some advice. And he went down the next morning, looked at it, gave them advice, and received a check that not only paid up his back debts, his own personal back debts, but gave enough to live on for quite a few more weeks. But the following week, he received a call from a church asking if he had anything to do with plans that had been drawn 10 years before to draw this church, or to build this church. Yes, well, we're ready, so come down now. But that isn't really enough. This is really pressed down. The next day, he received a call from the government, from Washington, together with a check for expenses to come down to New York, where he had to go for this other job, and to consult on the building of a housing community. And I'd like you to know that within 2 years that man was admitted to partnership in the firm that was doing the building of these community projects, government projects. Now, was it business or was it religion? Was it business or was it ordinary spiritual living, obeying the spiritual laws of Scripture in your life and then watching it develop into business? Well, now, the same thing I have witnessed ever since in every type of business activity, whether it was marketing a product or whether it was in relationships between corporations and labor. In whatever way these principles have been called upon, they have proven to be effective, but not by having anything to do with business, but by introducing spiritual principles into the business world. And part of that you will find in those same 2 chapters on human relationship. In Love Thy Neighbor, in practicing the presence and the relationship of oneness and the art of spiritual healing, when you begin to perceive that God is the one self, the one being, and you begin to realize that you are the same individual that I am, because I and my Father are one, is just as true of you as it is of me. And when I begin to behold that, then we begin to dwell in harmony. There again, as long as there are contracts in the business world, in the marital world, I suppose we'll go through the form of making contracts. But actually, there should be no necessity for those things. And in work like ours, there need be none. For this reason, just as you are learning that the only bond there is between us is a spiritual one, just as you are learning that we don't have to depend on memberships to have you come to lectures or classes, we don't have to depend on memberships to support the activity of the Infinite Way. We don't have to ask you to contribute weekly or monthly or yearly. In fact, we don't have to ask you, period. Because the spiritual law is the law of supply. And it's not dependent on man whose breath is in his nostrils. It's not even dependent on princes. It is dependent only on the presence and activity of Christ, spiritual presence, in individual consciousness. Now, once you begin to realize that he that is within me is greater than he that is in the world, that he performeth that which is given me to do, he perfecteth that which concerneth me, and you get an actual consciousness that there is a he within you, then this he it is, this presence, this invisible, that goes before you to make the crooked places straight. It is that which goes before you to be the cement of relationships. This just came into my thought, an experience that I had on the road as a salesman. There was one man in Kansas City whom I never could sell. He was just determined that he wasn't going to buy from me, and for many, many years he didn't. And on this particular trip, I thought, well, it's foolish just to waste time going over there to hear him say no. And so I'll go to a practitioner first and see what happens afterward. And so before I went to that store, I looked up a practitioner in the town and found a man in his office, told him my story, and he said, well, it isn't a question of whether that man buys from you or not. It is only a question that human will and human domination have no place in the spiritual life. Because as a spiritual being, he can only be subject to the same spiritual power that you are. And so the whole thing comes down to whether or not you believe that there can be another power handling any man. So he threw the treatment right back at me and not at the man. Then when I went in the store that morning and the man said no, no reason, I just said, well, it seems surprising to me that a man as successful as you are could for so many years refuse to look at the line of a man who's as successful as I am. I have a reputation for styles, for qualities, for everything, and you don't even know what that reputation is made up of. If you're right, when can I have an appointment? Now, again, that wasn't business, you see. That was spiritual living. I had been violating spiritual living. I was seeing that man as a man, with a will of his own, with a mind of his own, and not even a pleasant one. And therefore, it was I who was doing the malpracticing. It wasn't he who was being mean. Because the minute I released him from the belief that he was mean, he was a fine man. So you see, to me, business really isn't business. Business is just spiritual living or rather, it is one facet of spiritual living. And the same thing, whether it's business or whether it's marriage, or whether it is spiritual teaching, or whether it is school teaching, or anything else, it really is just a matter of spiritual living. That's all it is. I had the pleasure one time of working with a school teacher who was having the usual trouble of New England, of bad weather all winter, and many absences from school during January, February, March, and a certain amount of pupils left back every term. And I worked with that school teacher throughout a whole summer vacation. And when she went back, she had, first of all, the experience of going through January, February, March, when they were having an average of something like 20% or 23% absences, and she had 5%. And coming to the end of the term without one student being left back. And that teacher, who had never gone any further than the normal course, went on from there with the help of the authorities and eventually received her doctorate and was appointed by the state of Massachusetts to be their world educational officer, traveling the world to learn new ideas and bring them back on education. She brought them back, all the ideas she learned up on Massachusetts Avenue. Because the activity is really a religious activity. It is really one of being a practitioner to the children in the school, and knowing that they're not children of parents, that there is only one Father, and that's the Father in heaven. And therefore, they have only the mind of God. They only have the life of God, and they only have the health of God. And again, they are not subject to weather, climate, which is an effect, an outside influence. They're not subject to germs. They're subject only to His government. The government is on His shoulders. The jurisdiction is in God, the life of man. And it is only necessary to sit up front and behold that out in front of you to have it reflected back to you. So whether it's in a classroom of that kind or a classroom of this kind, don't be at all surprised that you get back what you are giving. And when you are beholding God as individual being, as the mind of man, as the life and the soul, and are willing to look through the human failings, you will find out that you have taken the burden of guilt, human guilt, off of every shoulder, and everyone feels it, and they respond to you. And the first thing you know is they think you are very loving. And humanly, you aren't at all. It's only spiritually that you are knowing the truth, which is a religious way of life, of knowing. Because ultimately, that is how the lamb will lie down with the lion. Once we begin to perceive that the mind of a lion and the mind of the lamb is the same mind, they're not two minds or two kinds of minds, there's one. When we behold that, we will bring it forth in demonstration. We've witnessed that in the lives of one of our students whose neighbor had a pet lion until it was full grown, and right living in the house with him, walking out on the lawn with him. So all things are possible to spiritual living. And business isn't business really, it's a form of spiritual living. If you bring your business into your spiritual life, if you don't separate them, then the same principles that apply in getting along with people in your family or getting along with your neighbors applies with getting along with all others. We had this work one year in Portland. I had a little group of businesswomen who came in to the Truth Center where I was working every noon at 12:05, and we had a lesson and a meditation until 12:25. And they went out and had a bite of lunch and went back to work. And we started out this particular week with an experiment. And the experiment was along this very line that I'm telling you, that when you go out of this door, stop for a minute, stop being a human being, and try to realize that those that you see, those you meet, are really the same selfhood as you are yourself. They are divine being. They are really God in individual form, regardless of what they may seem to be humanly. And go through this procedure as you go down the elevator, and as you walk the street, and as you go into your lunchroom, and then as you go back into your office or shop. And I want to tell you that before Friday, if you could hear the experiences that those people had brought into their lives in the business world, really it would make an interesting book of demonstration, of testimony, of the things that happened to them merely by changing their business life into a spiritual life and letting the business just be one of the facets of the experience. Well, now, that all comes back to the major theme that we have had this entire week. First of all, you have to know God aright, because if you think there is a God external to yourself, you're not thinking rightly and you're not living spiritually, because you're not living at one with God. To understand God aright, you must first of all know that God is in the midst of you, not separate and apart from you. God is not to be gained or won or searched after. God is to be recognized as one's self. We spell it with capital S-E-L-F just to show that it means the infinite self individualized as yourself and mine. And so it is then that we understand that God is really myself, then that I which I declare myself to be is really God being. It is really that offspring of God, that Son of God, that Christ of God. That is, God individualized, God in individual expression. And when you know this, you do not look outside of yourself, but rather you relax within yourself. Oh, God is closer to me than breathing, and I do not have to go to God, for God knoweth my need before I do. Remember, we go back to Luke 12:22 to 32, which is also in Matthew, that your heavenly Father knoweth that you have need of these things. Well, now remember that it isn't God in heaven that knows you have need of these things. It's God in the midst of you that knows you have need of these things. And then listen to that next miraculous statement. And it is His good pleasure to give you the kingdom. You don't earn it. You don't deserve it. Nobody humanly could be good enough to deserve God's grace. But it is ours by right of inheritance. The I of our being is the Christ of God or Son of God, and it is heir of God and joint heir. So whether we earn it or deserve it or not has nothing to do with the fact that as the Son of God I cannot be disinherited. That too brings up an interesting illustration. There was a woman who was the daughter of very wealthy parents, and she married against their wishes. Well, she also married a great deal of wealth, so she had no need of money, and she wasn't concerned about money. But her mother had some wonderful, rare antiques, which had been in the family for generations, and there was one particular rug which had always been promised to this particular woman, and she looked forward someday to owning it. And when her mother and father passed on, they had disinherited her. And so she paid no attention to it, because so far as the money was concerned, it really meant nothing to her, and she wasn't a bit desirous of having it. But then she remembered this rug. And this was a year after, 2 years after the passing of her parents. And she thought, well, probably it's possible that my sister will let me have that rug anyhow. And so I'll write my lawyer to get in touch with her. And the lawyer did, and the lady said no. Mother didn't want her to have it, and she isn't going to have it. She's disinherited. And that struck a note up here, and this lady said, disinherited? God disinherited his child? I don't believe it. God can't disinherit, and that is the only parent. I just can't believe that it can happen. And so she wrote her lawyer to find out what the will really said. And when the lawyer went to find out, there wasn't any will. And when he searched the records, there wasn't any will. Finally, he contacted the lawyer of the other side. The lawyer said, well, of course, it was probated the day after, so forth and so on. I remember it distinctly, and can't find a record of it. And sure enough, there was no record. And then the lawyer started searching, and he found the will under the blotter on his desk. His clerk had placed it there because he had something else to do and forgot it. It never had been probated, and the lady got her rug and a lot of other things too. But you see, not because she wanted property, not because she wanted even a rug, but because she was living spiritually. She was living in the constant realization that her parents weren't human beings. And because she was living spiritually, she demonstrated spiritually. And so you see, you can't violate spiritual living and then demonstrate spiritual good. You can't walk around talking about my mother and my father, how good they are or how bad they are, and then demonstrate spiritual abundance. There is a need on the part of all of us to live spiritually, and then watch how spiritual living governs our business and our inheritances and everything else that concerns our affairs. But to live spiritually, you must know the nature of God. Now, you see, unless you knew that God is the only parent, you would not be living spiritually. You would be living according to the human belief that you have a mother and father on the earth, and you would either benefit or suffer in accordance with whether they happen to be good or bad, generous or ungenerous, rich or poor. Whereas, if, while respecting our human parents, we would get over some of our slushy sentimentality and realize that God is really the parent, the creative principle, the maintaining and sustaining principle, we could then be as affectionate as we wanted to be on the human level, and yet not putting our parents in the false light of being parents when they aren't. They're human caretakers. But the Father in heaven is the creative principle. Now, it is the same way. Unless you know to a point of conviction that your Heavenly Father that is within you, closer to you than breathing, already knoweth your need, and that it is His good pleasure to give you the kingdom, you can't live spiritually on the subject of supply. You will always be looking to man whose breath is in his nostril, and if it isn't a parent, it'll be a wife or a husband or a child. And the pitiful part is that when all these fail, we have to turn to a cold government and ask them to take over and give us our pittance. Why? Because we have decided to live by the human standard that our good must come to us by earthly means through earthly people instead of living spiritually, which would really mean living in the realization that there is a He within me, and that it is His good pleasure to give me the kingdom, and He knoweth my needs before I do, and this changes our prayers so that we can live and pray spiritually. And to pray spiritually means never to go to the Father for anything, only to go to the Father with something, with love, with confidence, with assurance, with remembrance, with realization. Again, the people who live humanly always are going places to get something from somebody. The people who are living spiritually are always going someplace to take something to somebody. Those who live spiritually have not only an abundance, but 12 baskets full left over, and it is their main function in life to serve, to give, to share, to cooperate, to do. The getting comes by reflected action. In other words, the bread that we cast on the water always comes back to us, and it comes back multiplied. But the point is that spiritual living doesn't look for it to come back. It forgets itself. Greater love has no man than to lay down his life. And always, spiritual living has its foundation in a forgetfulness of self in the service to God and man. Now, of course, we can sometimes seem to be fulfilling that while violating it. Because, as the Master pointed out, we may be going out and doing a tremendous amount of benevolence and charity and calling attention to ourselves so as to get our brother man's thanks and recognition. And the moment we do that, we may gain his thanks and recognition, but we lose God's grace. The only grace that comes to us is in the good we do that is not known, that which is done silently, sacredly, secretly. For that which the Father seeth in secret, He rewardeth openly. Always remember that this Father is closer to you than breathing. You can't fool it, because it is yourself. It is your intelligence. It is your wisdom. It is the very guiding instinct of your being. So you can't fool it. It would be like reaching out with your eyes closed and stealing something and thinking God didn't see you. No, God is right at the center of your being. And the moment you violate a spiritual principle, you are out of tune with it. And violating a spiritual principle doesn't mean necessarily sinning in the world's ways of sinning. Remember that if you call your mother and father, you're sinning. You are missing the spiritual mark. It is only when you silently and secretly remember, only one is my Father, the one that is within me, then you are in tune with the infinite. And in the same way, when your life reflects the fact that you know that all the Father hath is mine. Now remember, the affirmation, all that the Father hath is mine, is not going to do anything for anybody. But to know it to the point of realization and say, well, in that case then, I don't have to be concerned about getting, I merely have to be concerned about outpouring, sharing, cooperating, giving, loving, so forth. Then, when our life follows that pattern, it is spiritual living. And others may call it being a philanthropist, but it isn't. It isn't. It's just spiritual living. Some may call it good business, but it isn't. It's spiritual living. And spiritual living carried into the home life, business life, church life, every phase of life is that which brings us the everlasting peace that passeth understanding. Now, all of this is dependent on your knowing, first of all, that God is your selfhood and the selfhood of everyone you meet. Then it is dependent on your knowing that the Father within you knoweth your need, so that you don't have to take up a lot of time telling him about it. And you have to know that it is his good pleasure to give you the kingdom, and just rest and relax in that assurance. That's the assurance that you'll find in our pamphlet, The Secret of the 23rd Psalm. When you have that assurance, you're really living the spiritual life. Then you have to realize that this God upon whom you're relying is not something external to you or separate and apart from you, but is your own selfhood under the name of I. That I, which is at the center of my being, which I call myself, that I is really the offspring of God, God individualized, or the Christ, the Son of God, which is heir of God. Therefore, I am the Son of God, heir of God, joint heir to all the heavenly riches. And as I abide in that word, never looking out here, but at the same time always performing every task that is given me to do, doing my work every day, not running away to hide from the world, but doing all things that are given me to do without any thought of result or reward, relying always on I within me to give me, not for reward. It is dangerous to accept the belief of a God that punishes or a God that rewards. For God does not reward. Whatever God does, God merely does as a function of God. You might liken it to the sun and sunshine and sunlight. The sun doesn't shine and give light and warmth as a reward to anybody for anything. That is its function. And it can't help it, and it can't even withhold it. And so it is with God. God can't withhold, not even from the sinner. God has no such qualities. God is not a human being. God doesn't act like a human parent or a judge on the bench. Not at all. God is infinite being and is forever being infinite being. And God can't give and God can't withhold God can only be. And your knowing this truth brings that God being into active experience in your life. You are only called upon to know the truth about God. And then you relax in God. Then you come to probably the most difficult part of all for most students, because we are accustomed to speaking of God as the one power and the all power. We do not really realize that means that God is not a power. In other words, to be a power indicates that it is a power over some other power or against some other power. But God isn't a power over any other power or against any other power, because there aren't any other powers. And so, God, rightly understood, isn't a power. God is a being. And God is always being God. And there is no power being exercised, because if there were, it would certainly have to be exercised upon something, over something, against something, to something, for something. But God has nothing to do anything for. God has nothing to do anything to. God is always love. And love isn't love over anything. Love is just love. God is intelligence, but intelligence isn't a power over anything. Intelligence is just intelligence. Life isn't over anything. There's no life over death, because death doesn't exist as a reality. Death doesn't exist. And the mere fact that Jesus could raise them from the dead, and some of our practitioners have sometimes done it, is proof that death is not a power. Therefore, God is not a power over disease, because disease isn't a reality. And that is why all this attempt to pray to God to heal your patient is just that much waste of time. You may actually bring about a healing that way, but it won't be because God had anything to do with it. It will be because you were fulfilling your faith. You could have had just as much faith in a Christopher's medal and it would have done the work. You could have had just as much faith in St. Anthony's bones and it would have done the work, because all those things do the work. They all have some manner of healings. And there are a few people who pray to God for health and get it. Not many, but here and there a few. But it isn't from God, be assured of that. If God ever answered anyone's prayer to heal anyone, God would be a monster. What? God answer my prayer to heal you and leave all these other people unhealed? That is like praising God for stopping the European war while the Japanese war is going on. Can God do half a job? No, if God was stopping wars, there wouldn't have been one started in the first place. Wars just go on until somebody runs out of ammunition or food, and then they stop. Now, when the light begins to dawn in your consciousness that you cannot use God, you are beginning to live spiritually. Because as long as you think you can use God, you're holding yourself superior to God. You're holding yourself as if you could tell God what he should be doing to this poor soul. As if you had more love in your heart for them than God has. And as if you were urging God to use his power on their behalf, which of course he isn't doing until you get there. You see, the beginning of spiritual wisdom is when you know the nature of God. And you don't while you think that you know better than God, or while you believe there's something you can tell God, or while you believe that God can do something for one individual that God isn't doing equally for everyone, as if the Scripture didn't say God is no respecter of persons. Now, once you begin to behold that God isn't a power to be used, and God isn't a power that destroys your enemies. Don't you know that was one of the Hebrew teachings that the Master came to do away with? Ye have heard it said of old, Oh, strike down my enemies. Oh, go out before us and kill them all and let us take their wives for our slaves. And God did many times, according to the Hebrew Testament. But you know better than that. God isn't going to enslave anybody for your sake. And once you understand that it couldn't be the nature of God to do evil to anyone, you would know the futility of praying to God to have your enemy harmed or to lose the war or to, well, the same thing comes in business and competition. How many people are praying for success knowing that if they get it, it'll be at the loss of their competitor? But that's not praying, and there's no God listening to such prayers. If there were competitors and they'd get their heads together and say, how can we both give better service and increase the amount of business in this neighborhood, we'd all have better business instead of trying to gain our business at the expense of a competitor. Now, don't believe for a minute that God prospers a man to do business at somebody else's expense. So you learn to pray spiritually. And to pray spiritually means never to pray selfishly, never to pray for your own gain, never to pray for your own benefit, but to make your prayer a realization of God's lovingness, universally, equally, impartially. Would that give abundance to everyone? No. No, because those who are living in violation of it could not benefit by it if you prayed for it from now till doomsday. Your prayers cannot benefit the person who is in violation of God's law, except to the extent that sometimes it might awaken them and bring them into God's law. But you cannot benefit them while they are in violation of God's law, and that explains many lack of healing. Many times we wonder why we aren't healing someone, not really knowing that inside of them they're really living in violation to some law of God. And there's no way to do it. The only way you could benefit them is if your prayers could awaken them and put them on the spiritual path, then the healing could follow. And that is why if your prayers or treatment were aimed at just healing somebody's physical discords, you'd mostly fail, because the physical discords are merely the externalization of a false state of consciousness. It may not be an evil one, it may be just the ignorance of spiritual law. It may be just that very difference between being a taker and being a giver. And that is one of the tragedies, too, of a great deal of life, that you witness it to a great extent. The amount of church people who indulge in begging. Oh, for very good causes. Oh, yes, they're all out for very good causes. But they're begging for it. They're getting. And that's not the law of God. There's no provision for begging in the law of God. None whatsoever. No justification for it, and actually no need of it. Because as an individual would accept their responsibility and realize, I and my Father are one. And as long as I'm living in the realization of God as knowing my need before I do, and of God as supplying it as His good pleasure, as long as I'm not looking to man whose breath is in his nostril, but I am looking to the Father within me to be the presence that goes before me, then everything will come in some way that will support any activity in which we are engaged. And it would really make no difference what it would be. And so it is that if we want to support activities, we can support them without them coming to us and begging for what their needs are. And not only that, but by our recognition, looking around at our own communities, just our tiny little neighborhood where we live, and finding what is their need. And it would make no difference whether it's a YMCA or a YMHA or a hospital or whatnot, and saying, well, all right, I must provide my share of it. you take from them the need for begging, but you also take from yourself the need of ever having a need, because your own need is met in the giving, not in the receiving. That lesson came home to me one night sitting in a Christian Science church, looking up on the wall and seeing that sign, "Divine love always has met and always will meet every human need." And knowing all the people in the church, I looked around and I said, didn't so. I know too many here have been waiting years and years and years for that divine love to meet their need, and it just hasn't happened. And then the thought came to me, why did Mrs. Eddy choose that? She must have had a special reason for choosing that for 3,000 church walls. What was that reason? And as I sat pondering it, all of a sudden, the meaning of it dawned on me. Why, Mrs. Eddy was right, but all the people sitting in the church were wrong. They were reading it backwards. It says, divine love always has met and always will meet every human need. But divine love isn't out here. Divine love is inside. Therefore, it is the divine love we express that meets our human need. And unless we are expressing an impersonal, impartial, universal love, there is no love meeting our need. And so in that very evening, I saw this whole picture. There's no divine love out here. There's no God out here meeting our need. The God and the divine love is within us, but as long as we aren't expressing it, it is unexpressed. As long as it's unexpressed, it cannot meet our human need. Now, what constitutes divine love? Forgiveness, charity, benevolence, kindness, forgiveness, cooperativeness, all of the things that you can possibly think about, sharing. All of these things constitute divine love. But if we aren't expressing that divine love, it isn't going out to return to us, meeting our need. And of course, you can imagine that that was one of the points that brought a change into my way of life, because I saw how foolish it is to sit around waiting for God to do something. That would make God a vacuum for some moments. That would make God a do-nothing. It can't be. God is forever being God. So there's no use waiting for God to do something tomorrow. God is already doing it. And the question is, are we an instrument through which it is being done? Are we an instrument as which God is functioning? Well, not while we're sitting around waiting for divine love to move on the face of the waters, but while we are being an instrument through which and as which the nature of God can find expression. In other words, wisdom, intelligence, love, when life. Now, you know, life stops functioning for us the very moment we say, what's the use? The very moment we say, oh, there's nothing ahead. That moment life stops functioning, and we are like the chicken who has had its head cut off. We'll wiggle around for a little while, but we're dead. And that's how we get so many living dead on earth. They've given up. They're not living, they're not expressing, they're not joying, they're not sharing, they're not being, they're not cooperating, they're not letting themselves be an instrument for God. They just have become a dead weight, waiting for a God to make them happy or prosperous or successful, and they're dead. Their lives are finished, even if they have some other years ahead of them to moan. God is living our lives, but we are only the transparency for that while we are letting that life live. And you know, our lives in any moment could be outwardly a blank. At any moment, something may come up to divest us of our money, or of our health, or of our business. And the question would be whether we jump out a window or just wait for the undertaker to come along naturally, or whether we get up the next day and brush our clothes off and start over again, letting God live by starting to give, even if we have nothing left to give. But, well, I know this story from absolute knowledge of our friend Henry Thomas Hamlin in England, of how many times people came to his door during and after the war needing shoes, and he took the shoes off his feet and gave them away and waited for another pair to come in. The only pair he had, but they were yours. And so it was with food. He received many care packages from the States, but always they were opened and put out on his porch so that anyone who had need of food could come up and help themselves. Now, there was no loss to him in that, because he lived. He was living in what he was doing. It satisfied his sense of the highest right. And it certainly is a testimony that he lived to be 85 and only had to suffer a few days of ill health before taking his departure. In other words, he graduated without any difficulty. So it is that we have to understand this. This looking to a God is an ignorance of what God is. And there is no spiritual living on that basis. Spiritual living begins with your knowing the truth. And the truth you have to know is about God. When you perceive this entire nature of God, and then take up this final point, God is not a power, God is a being. You could argue that, in this sense, that roses only come from rose bushes, pineapples only come from pineapple bushes, and peaches only come from peach trees, and so there must be some power ordaining that or maintaining that. And you would be right. In that sense, God is the creative principle, the maintaining and sustaining principle, but that is not God being a power over anything. That is merely a power in expression. In other words, fish are in the sea and birds are in the air, and the tides come in and out on time because God is being, but not because God is a power doing something to tides. There is not God and tides. There is not God and roses. There is not God and sun, moon, and stars in motion. There is not God and a crop in the ground. But God is being, and forever revealing itself as the crop in the ground, or the oil in the ground, or the diamonds in the ground, or the movement of the sun, moon, and stars, and time and tides. Now, as you perceive this, you will relieve yourself of a tremendous strain, because you will no longer be looking to God to perform some miracle. You will not be looking to God to do something. You will be living in the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He leadeth me beside the still pastures. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures, and beside the still waters. And he maketh me to lie down in green pastures. Therefore, he is always functioning, always performing. I don't have to seek it, ask it, demand it, want it. I have to relax and let it be. Let it be me. Let God be my life. I live, yet not I. God, or Christ, liveth my life. And then my function is a relaxing, and let God be my life. Let God be the health of my countenance. Let God be my supply. Let God be my safety and my security. Don't tear your hair out running around looking for God to give you safety and security. He hasn't got any. God is safety and security, and God is closer to you than breathing, and he knoweth that you have need of safety and security and it is his good pleasure to give you safety and security because he is your safety and security. And the fact of omnipresence is the assurance of it. As long as you can say or think omnipresence or Emmanuel, God with us, you never need to pray for anything. Because Emmanuel is the presence of God, which is the health of your countenance, which is the cement of your relationships, which is your bread, wine, water, which is your high tower, your safety, your security, your abundance, your peace that passeth understanding. And even though there are snares and delusions in the world, pitfalls, and they will come to those in ignorance of God, they will not come nigh your dwelling place. And the only thing you can do for your neighbor is to keep praying that this is a universal truth in the hope that they will awaken by means of your prayer. But you can't give them a safety or security that they do not earn by their understanding of God. You can't give them a health or an abundance or a security that they haven't earned by their understanding of the nature of God and prayer. The only help you can give them is in the nature of awakening them to this. Now, there are times when you can be a temporary help to your neighbor, and mostly that is when they ask for it, and thereby bring themselves into accord with spiritual law, and occasionally when a parent will ask for help for a child, or a husband for a mother, or a wife for a husband, or a woman for a mother, man for a mother. In other words, when you have someone in your consciousness and you bring them to an illumined consciousness, you can be of some temporary help to them, but not permanently, because the moment they go back to their sins, their material way of living, their ignorance of God, worse things will come upon them. You can empty them of one devil just to make room for 7 more to come in, unless they are willing that their consciousness be raised. So it is that you very often will help people who want to be rid of their pains or diseases or sins, but they are no wise anxious to fill their consciousness with God. And so they've just been left with a vacuum, and some other discord will hop into it pretty soon. Do you see how the whole theme of this work has been an understanding of the nature of God, of the name of God, of the being and function of God? And when we have that, we need take no thought what we shall eat or what we shall drink. We need take no thought. Just do those things each day that are given us to do, and he that is within us will perfect it. Thank you.